Kevin Penkin. He's a name you know and love, and he's one of the rising stars in the world of anime. I want to make it really clear that I do think his music is amazing, and I really like his composition style. But again, I want to reiterate that Kevin Penkin, like Kazuya Yuki, is not a composer that I think is bad. I actually think both of them are great composers. And to address all the people who are probably going to see the title of the video and hear me say one thing that isn't blind praise for a composer that I think is great. Yes, I am a salty nobody who wants nothing but your attention because my music will never live up to anything that Kevin Penkin will write, and I'm sure that you've done many unspeakable things with my mother. I guess this is an apology video. Around the beginning of 2022, the anime world was rocked by news of a new Spice and Wolf project being announced. Series like Cardcaptor Sakura and The Devil is a Part-Timer had already given hope to anime fans that continuations could still happen even after over a decade of waiting. And now, fans of the original series could shed tears of joy at the thought that after 13 long years of waiting for a third season, they were finally about to get— oh wait, it's a remake. As someone who tried watching the original Spice and Wolf back when I was first getting into anime, it may have been one of the very first shows to fail the 3-episode rule. Since then, basically every show I've dropped has been something I never felt the need to revisit, but something about Spice and Wolf made me feel like I needed to give it another chance. Maybe it was the universal acclaim from the anime community, or maybe my preferences had simply matured to a point that I felt I could enjoy the slower, more intellectual story it wanted to tell. Either way, I felt it deserved another go, especially since the little bits of the soundtrack that I remembered were right up my alley. Then with the announcement that the new project was going to be a remake rather than a continuation, I actually became more interested in the series as I could enjoy the story from the start without feeling the pressure to watch the 2 previous seasons beforehand. I'll admit that I was excited, but also still a bit skeptical of how much I might enjoy it, considering Studio Passion was more of a meme to me than a studio to take seriously, and of course the composer being Kevin Penkin. Now, to reiterate my stance on Penkin's music, I like it. I think it sounds cool and it does a great job of setting the stage for the worlds it's meant to be creating. That said, I don't really connect with it on a deeper level or find the themes particularly memorable. This never proved itself a problem when I thought about composers writing genre-adjacent music to his, such as Kanno Yugo or Iwasaki Taku, and it wasn't some kind of weeb gatekeeping where I was refusing to acknowledge non-Japanese composers. After all, Evan Call, Rasmus Faber, and Ludwig Forsell have written some of my absolute favorite Annie songs and soundtracks, all of which I loved from the moment I first heard them. Whatever the reason, I needed the right kind of show to grasp onto Penkin's music. Made in Abyss didn't make that connection, Tower of God could have been the series if I had enjoyed it enough to not drop it, and Shield Hero, despite my love for fantasy, was not only another isekai with just an okay first season, but also arguably Penkin's least memorable soundtrack to date. It wasn't until the Made in Abyss movie and Season 2 aired that I started connecting with the music on a slightly deeper level. But what really started to turn me around was his collaboration with Kousaki Satoru and Okehazama Alisa for Apothecary Diaries, bringing out an entirely new side to his style that I hadn't heard in his music previously. Now primed and ready to fully embrace his newer works, all it would take was one more fantasy or historical show to win me over, and that's exactly what he did. Isekai has basically taken over the fantasy genre in anime, and for a long time it felt like everything within the genre had started growing stale. The worlds tend to be samey and simplistic, basing themselves off of each other to save any world-building explanations or interesting aspects that set them apart, focusing in on what are usually quite bland, one-note character archetypes. Important to note is that while music is one of the easier aspects to separate from the quality of a show, it still contributes heavily to the feeling of the story's world, and more often than not, there aren't many things to say about it either. That's not to say that there aren't exceptions within the isekai genre, but at a time where fantasy anime are rarely worth giving the time of day, Penkin's music is helping to revitalize and reshape the sound of the fantasy genre, placing the soundtrack of Spice and Wolf: Merchant Meets the Wise Wolf as one of the 3 pillars supporting the pure non-isekai fantasy genre within the world of modern anime. As with any good fantasy or sci-fi series, Penkin's Spice and Wolf soundtrack begins with an overture, a theme to set the stage of the series by placing us in the sonic headspace of the story's world. The track starts with soloist Elspeth Bodden vocalizing a beautiful melody, the simple ooze reminiscent of wolf howling up until the final note opens up into an ah, giving us a much more human sound. Without any supporting instruments or even a deeper analysis of the notes or rhythms, these two vocables alone perfectly capture the essence of Spice and Wolf's main fantasy element, that being the existence of Holo. As the intro solo comes to an end, a Celtic harp and strings are introduced, confirming the Irish style of music that was hinted at by the singer, notably with this scoop and this grace note. With the sung melody ending on G and the harp giving us a few bars of G minor 11, we're quickly placed in a common Irish key, G minor, showing off both Penkin and Bodden's attention to keeping this specific style of music in mind. While Penkin is no stranger to incorporating singers into his music, this attention to detail is a quality that helps set Spice and Wolf apart from the drab fantasy settings that lesser anime series have attempted to capture. A quality that, interestingly enough, doesn't even match with the dramatic setting of Spice and Wolf's pre-industrial world. The use of this style is twofold, as Celtic music and instruments are extremely common in fantasy stories of all sorts. Look no further than the grandfather of fantasy, The Lord of the Rings. As well as being a reference to how the original anime's music was also written in a Celtic style. While Irish jigs and upbeat pieces are common in this type of music, the other side of it gives us deeply emotional laments and ballads, lending itself well to the more serious narrative style that the remake takes in comparison to the original. In simpler terms, Penkin's skill at writing for singers alongside Bodden's deep understanding of Irish music makes for a perfect setup for this new series, all within the first few seconds of the overture's introduction. Getting back to the music, the high strings are replaced with a pizzicato cello, accompanied by Bodden as she begins singing what I can only assume are Irish lyrics. As someone entirely unfamiliar with Celtic languages, I have no idea what the words she's singing are, and without a publicly available lyric source to translate them with, I unfortunately can't do any lyrical analysis. That said, if we look at the chords for a moment, we get a progression of G minor, B flat, F13 sus2, E flat major 9, a 1-3-7-6. Ignoring the extensions, these bass chords are pretty standard, especially for a folk tune not specifically written in a Dorian mode. Notably, the music of the overture is much more focused on setting a precedent of the style of music we should expect moving forward, rather than showing off any of the innovative ways in which Penkin goes about writing some of the later themes. This is also very much in his style, as he has gone on record and also spoken anecdotally about how, despite being deeply knowledgeable about music and the ways in which he crafts certain sounds, a lot of the time the process is simply about making choices that sound the best in that moment.
I hate to say it, but I like the noise is the most accurate way to describe how I feel about music as well.
Right.
Oh my God.
Jumping ahead a little, we can also hear how the opening's howling motif is altered by these harmonies here, giving us some added tension through C minor 7, C minor 9, B flat 6, D minor 7, C minor 7, B flat over D, F, G minor. Here we have the vocal line moving in opposition to the bass notes, falling as the chords shift upwards and then rising as the bass line descends. With the frequent dissonant notes creating a richer texture within the performance, we can also start to interpret this vocal line as Holo herself, throwing a great deal of intrigue and mischief into the otherwise normal medieval Euro-based world. Like the notes in the music, Holo herself meshes well with the world and things around her, even when it is clear that her presence sets her apart from those surroundings, occasionally clashing with the harmony in both tone and rhythm. From bar 48, just before the second verse begins, we're hit with one final Penkinism to finalize each aspect of what we can expect moving forward with the soundtrack, some electronic synth tones for an otherworldly soundscape. In this overture, they're pretty subtle and merely add some atmosphere to the space created by the rest of the ensemble, but the inclusion of them hints at Penkin's affinity and love for synthesized sounds and electronic soundscapes, something that we wouldn't normally expect to hear in a medieval fantasy setting without good reason. And for the most part, there aren't too many interesting chord progressions, harmonies, or rhythms to point out aside from some stylistic choices Bodden adds to the performance. These bits of personality are more apparent when we hear her performance compared side by side with the instrumental version and an intimate acoustic version titled
Queenu.
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 Yeah, that. In this way, we get a strong sense of the feeling of the world we can expect moving forward without being overwhelmed by too many things, and by keeping the handful of things we've learned in mind, we can better understand the musical choices and other themes moving forward. Holo's theme is where we can start to understand the careful choices that were made regarding the use of synthesized and electronic sounds within the music. Like the overture, this track doesn't feature very prominent electronics. However, the bass line played mostly by the low strings is clearly supported by a non-acoustic instrument. This is most obviously heard during sections where the bass line slides up and down between notes, creating an unnatural glissando that most acoustic instruments simply wouldn't be able to perform in such a manner. As mentioned already, Penkin has a deep love of synthesizers and electronic sounds, and while other fantasy series he's worked on, such as Made in Abyss and Tower of God, feature them heavily, the distinctly otherworldly settings of those shows allowed for these kinds of inorganic soundscapes. Spice and Wolf, on the other hand, puts us in a familiar type of setting, that being of medieval Europe, leaving little room to stray from the norm without making the viewer feel as though something is out of place. Eurocentric fantasy settings have an expected sound that has been established throughout popular media for decades. Rich orchestral ensembles and choirs, or smaller jigs and folk tunes, dominate the space for the fantasy genre, and stepping out of this space with electronics or even rock band instruments tends to take us out of the space that is meant to be established. So how does Penkin, a man with such a love for non-fantasy compliant sounds, get away with using them in a pre-established medium? In the simplest of answers, he ties these electronic sounds to the specific aspects of the story that don't exist in reality. Holo is more or less the only aspect of the story that doesn't mesh with the real world, so by utilizing, for lack of a better word, unnatural sounds only in pieces associated with her, we get a deeper sense that even if the sounds are pleasant and Holo's existence makes sense in the world of Spice and Wolf, we feel the out-of-placeness as a natural contrast with the setting. As viewers living in the real world, we understand that something like Holo couldn't exist here, so when we hear sounds that don't mesh with our understanding of the setting, we subconsciously pair these two aspects together and fit them into the world in the same way that Lawrence and the other characters do when they discover Holo's true identity. This may be a lot of explanation for a simple synth bass in Holo's theme, but now that it's been explained, let's delve into some of the more electronic tracks to get a better understanding of how Penkin was able to let his imagination run wild within the limitations of the setting. Where Holo's theme utilized a simple bass synth to represent how she hides her true nature, Evo is much more brazen with its use of synthesized sounds. The previous bass mostly stayed hidden, simply doubling the low strings to tell us that while we may be aware that something is off with her, for the most part she can pass as a regular human to those around her. As this current track plays most importantly in episode 6, when Holo transforms into a wolf for the first time in the show, these electronic elements come out more strongly to emphasize the otherworldliness of the event. Right from the very start, the piano line is doubled by a melodic synth, while also supplemented with what sounds like reversed audio chops underneath. The bass, once again doubling the low strings, comes in much more prominently for this piece, and it might be more appropriate to say that the low strings are actually doubling the bass synth. In the middle of the track, we also have a brief section where most of the instruments drop out, leaving only the singer and some synth textures in a lull before the more intense breakdown.
Ah. 'Cause
While they are fairly difficult to hear, these electronic sounds actually remain during the following section, playing underneath to add a richness to the scale of intensity. And it isn't only the actual electronic sounds themselves at work, as varying levels of reverb on different instruments gives the music a sense of warped space, with the drums especially ringing out more deeply and intensely than the rest of the ensemble. All of this checks out with the idea of Holo's transformation taking effect, going from a human form with ears and a tail to a giant wolf unlike anything we could imagine existing in our world. This track wastes no time in introducing its electronics, opening with a textural wall of shimmery sounds. Given that this is the titular piece on the soundtrack, it feels fitting that these synthesized sounds stay present throughout the entirety of the track, creating a wash of different colors and textures to lose ourselves within. It's also important to note how many layers of electronics are added in as the track progresses, giving Penkin the outlet to let his electronic creativity flow out at the appropriate moments. On top of the electronic sounds, the melody is led only by acoustic instruments. A harp for the beginning section, xylophone during the transition, and Ilian pipes, tin whistle, and fiddle for the final section. This allows these two worlds of fantasy and reality to mesh together, with Lawrence as the spice represented by these instruments, while Holo as the wolf is represented through the more textural elements. For all intents and purposes, Lawrence is a regular human in this world governed by regular humans, and so the representative instruments are put at the forefront as the messengers or lens through which we see the world. While Holo is equally important to the story, a differing role she plays is to show how the world is not as straightforward as Lawrence's logic-based take on it is, and thus the expected instruments at the forefront are supported by unexpected sounds that make up the unknown parts of the world. It's not often that high fantasy settings or their light fantasy adjacents like Spice and Wolf are supplemented with soundtracks that heavily feature electronic sounds. Due to our preconceived expectations of how these worlds should sound, it's only natural that orchestras and folk ensembles are so prominently featured within this genre. That isn't to say that fantasy-style settings never include these kinds of things, but picturing series like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, or The Witcher with synths or electric band instruments just wouldn't feel right. So it's incredibly impressive that Kevin Penkin was able to not only implement these sounds naturally into Spice and Wolf's soundtrack, but that he was able to do so in a logical way that genuinely sounds amazing. And in a world of music that the average listener may not be able to separate by composition style alone, it's reassuring to know that composers like Penkin are still able to innovate and create new ways to bring these well-trodden worlds to life. So yes, in case you were still unsure of how I feel about Kevin Penkin's music, I am a fan of it. Considering I'm calling his soundtrack for Spice and Wolf one of the three pillars holding up the fantasy genre for modern anime, I'm not really sure how you could think otherwise anymore, but here's another mention just to hopefully get people off my back. With Dungeon Meshi as one of the other pillars, I mentioned that its soundtrack by Mitsuda Yasunori is the most innovative of the three, and while I do still stand by that statement, I think it needs an asterisk. Mainly because Spice and Wolf's soundtrack is equally, if not even more innovative, but in a completely different way. Where Mitsuda utilized the tried and true methods we understand about fantasy music and flipped the composition style on its head, Penkin focused on the actual sounds being produced, reshaping the way we understand fantasy music and creating something new and unexpected. I didn't even get to talk about his purely acoustic tracks or some of the amazing vocal work he wrote for pieces like Chronicle and Winter Solstice and Ulv, but maybe I can save those for another video. And with that, there's only one more fantasy pillar left for me to talk about, so make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit that bell so you don't miss out on its release. And don't forget to like the video and leave a comment down below. And if you want to help support the channel and get access to exclusive videos and all the transcriptions I've written for all of my analysis videos, make sure to go over and support me on Patreon. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one.